Hello and welcome to this video on net exports X minus M. So in this video we're going to look at the terms trade deficit and trade surplus, look at the impact of net exports on the circular flow of income, and then look at the main influences on the trade balance. So let's start off with discussing what trade means. Trade is the movement of goods and services across borders, and here we're interested in exports and imports. Exports is money coming into the country for goods or services that are leaving the country, whereas imports are the opposite, that is goods or services arriving and money leaving the country. Now, exports and imports are a component of aggregate demand, and it's interesting to look at the equation for aggregate demand and note that exports would be a positive contribution. So because it's money coming into the country, this is a positive contribution to demand in the economy, whereas imports, because that is money leaving the country, means that the demand is going elsewhere. So that is a negative component of AD. X minus M, that term within aggregate demand, the difference between exports and imports, is often called net exports because the imports have been subtracted, or sometimes the trade balance or balance of trade. So let's look at two key terms now, trade deficit and trade surplus. A trade deficit is where the value of imports exceeds the value of exports. So the balance of trade overall will be a negative number, M is greater than X. A trade surplus, on the other hand, is when the value of exports exceeds the value of imports. So normally this would be a positive value in the balance of trade, X is greater than M. Let's now look at the impact that the balance of trade would have on the circular flow of income. So exports are considered an injection into the circular flow, whereas imports are a withdrawal. So if exports are greater than imports, we would describe this as being a trade surplus, and this would be a net injection into the circular flow of income. On the other hand, if imports were greater than exports, we would describe this as being a trade deficit, and this would be a net withdrawal from the circular flow of income. Okay, so we've looked at our first two objectives. Now let's move on and look at the main influences on the trade balance. So there are 5 main influences on the trade balance that we need to be aware of. And we're going to go through these 5 in turn. Let's start off with number 1, which is real income. Now, real income is earnings adjusted for the impact of inflation. If earnings growth outstrips inflation and real incomes rise, then people will have more purchasing power. They will feel perhaps wealthier if they're saving that extra income. And depending on the marginal propensity to import this extra income, this may lead to increased imports and a worsening overall of net exports or the balance of trade. So if people's extra income, a larger proportion of that is spent on imports, they have a high marginal propensity to import within the economy, then real income growth may lead to more imports. Okay, number 2 is the exchange rate. And a quick reminder, the exchange rate is the price of one currency in terms of another. And again, our acronym to try and remember the impact would be along the lines of SPICED. Strong pound makes imports cheap, exports dear. And obviously that would apply to any currency, not just the pound. So if the currency is stronger, i.e. the exchange rate is rising in terms of what that currency will buy. So for example, moving from £1 to $1 to £1 to $3 would be a strengthening of the exchange rate. This will normally have a negative effect on the balance of trade because it makes imports cheaper, so more imports, exports more expensive, so less exports, and a worsening of the balance of trade. On the flip side, a weak currency, WIPDEC, might be the phrase we might use. If the exchange rate got weaker, so £1 only bought 50 cents or half a dollar, then we'd expect an improvement in the balance of trade. More exports because they're cheaper, less imports because they're more expensive. So let's have a little look, a bit more of a discussion about this. So the effects of a currency depreciation. So where a currency gets weaker, we would describe that as being a currency depreciation. So when the pound appreciates against the US dollar, the impact of that WIPODEC would make imports more expensive and exports cheaper. And then the impact of that, well, it will change the demand for imports and exports. Import sales will contract, less demand if prices rise, and export sales will expand, more demand if prices fall. What might be the impact of a currency appreciation? So this is where a currency gets stronger. Well, if the currency appreciates, this might be the line of analysis that we would take. It means a rise in external purchasing power. £1 buys more euros or dollars, or whatever other currency. This makes it cheaper to import goods and services, leading to rising demand for imports, although we may note that actually this depends on the elasticity of demand, which would lead to a worsening of the trade balance. A trade deficit may rise, and a fall in aggregate demand because of rising leakages from the circular flow. So this would be a nice 6-step analysis to explain the effect of a currency appreciation. In terms of valuation, we must just bear in mind that even though the prices change of imports, price is not the only factor affecting demand. So other things like quality might affect demand as well. We should also note that appreciating currency leads to lower costs of imported raw materials, which may help to restore competitiveness within the economy. So if we're making imports cheaper and those imports are raw materials, then actually that might be quite beneficial for our economy. And lastly, this point about price elasticity is a very good one to try and understand. We've changed the price of imports and we've assumed therefore there'll be rising demand. But actually the relationship between demand and the price change is governed by price elasticity of demand. And if demand is price inelastic, then there's unlikely to be much of a change in demand for imports, and therefore the trade balance is unlikely to get worse. So a good way to evaluate any changes in currency values is to talk about the price elasticity of demand for those products. Finally, on terms of exchange rates, a reminder that we would be illustrating these effects using an aggregate demand diagram. So a currency appreciation would make exports more expensive, imports cheaper, and is likely to lead to an inward shift of AD due to our net withdrawals. So AD would be shifting inwards if there was a currency appreciation. If it was a depreciation, we'd expect AD maybe to shift outwards as exports rise and imports reduce. Okay, the third one is the strength of the global economy. So previously we've looked that economies don't operate in isolation. They rely on other economies to be their trading partners. So for example, if there was a recession in Germany, but the UK does not suffer a slowdown, Germany will be buying fewer exports from the UK and will try and export more to the UK. And obviously that will have an impact on the level of exports and imports within the UK and therefore the level of aggregate demand within the UK. Okay, number 4 is a concept called protectionism. And protectionism is when a government restricts free trade between economies. This is often done through the introduction of tariffs. Often governments do this to try and force people within that economy to buy domestic products rather than buying imports, so they can preserve jobs in their own economy and avoid that withdrawal of money through imports. It can also be done through quotas, setting a physical limit on the amount of imports, through certain regulations saying we won't allow you to buy something from another country if it doesn't meet certain environmental or health and safety regulations, and through subsidies, so by giving companies money so they can lower their prices, so therefore people within the economy don't buy imports as much, they buy products from their own economy. So protectionism, the introduction of tariffs or taxes on goods and imports, quotas, regulations, subsidies, can restrict free trade between economies and reduce the level of imports, which may maintain aggregate demand within their own economy. Okay, the final influence on the balance of trade might be non-price factors. So everything we've talked about so far might have an impact on volume or price. Here we might be talking about, well, actually the price might not be important if quality or after-sales service is more important. So they will often have a strong influence on the level of net exports. Some countries cannot compete effectively on price but have high quality design and manufacture. And if you look at the flags in the background here, there is a slight clue as to two companies this might apply to. On one side, we have China, who are extremely price competitive in terms of their products, and that's one of the main reasons why they have a very positive trade surplus. On the right-hand side, we have Germany. Now, they have a very large trade surplus as well, and it's not so much on price competitiveness, but more on the high quality and the design and manufacture of the products that the German economy makes. So this could be an important influence on the level of imports and exports, not just price, but also non-price factors like quality. So we've looked at the terms trade deficit and trade surplus. We've looked at the impact of net exports on the circular flow, and then finally looked at the 5 influences on the trade balance. That's it. Thank you very much.